In this module, we're going to be looking at the historical trends which have shaped the attitudes to property finance and investment that we have today. What we're going to be finding is that over the last 50 years, the entire attitude towards property investment has changed at least once, and perhaps more. What we need to do is understand how these historical changes that we're going to explore, partly as cultural changes, have influenced the supposed attractiveness of property investment, have helped people make a lot of money, but have also caused people to lose a lot of money over that period. I hope that in this module I give you at least some ideas that are going to help you to make wise decisions when it comes to forecasting the overall direction of property into the future, and especially the advantages of the different strategies of property investment. In the module, I have a practical element which is going to be taking you through the mechanics of what is known as leverage, what is known as negative gearing. Negative gearing was a rather peculiar investment strategy that came into common use in the 1970s. Previous to that, it would have been considered crazy. However, many people made a lot of money during the 1970s and the 1980s using this negative gearing, and it still remains as a very popular investment strategy for property investors, especially small property investors today. However, when we look at the history and the changes and the dynamics behind the changes, what we're going to be seeing is that perhaps the way that negative gearing was not very attractive in the 1950s and the 1960s, but then was attractive during the 1970s and the 80s, became unattractive in the early 90s, but was very attractive during the late 1990s up to probably about 2005, leaves us with a big question mark. That is, whether or not this strategy is really useful today, or what to look out for if we think it's going to be useful in the future. And so the investment strategy that we need to understand is negative leveraging or negative gearing, but the background to its application and when to apply it, we need to look closely at these historical trends of cultural changes and the risks that they've introduced. To work through this, there's going to be basically a PowerPoint presentation and e-lecture. There's also some recommended reading that I've trimmed down to the minimum for you, basically one paper, which is very much a representation of what is in the PowerPoint. I also recommend some extension reading and watching, for that matter, that you may find useful, especially those students who find this area of interest and want to take it a bit further. And in that regard, I would especially recommend that you look at the YouTube lecture by Elizabeth Warren. Warren is an academic and a legal professor of law, who took an interest in the question of why there were an inordinate number of families going bankrupt around the early 2000s. What she came up with was quite interesting and rather surprising. Her material relates to the United States, but hopefully after we look at the situation in Australia, we're going to find that Warren's conclusions and the mechanics of what she sees going on behind the scenes are very much at work in Australia. That's fairly easy to watch Warren's lecture. And the other optional resource, extension resource that I'd recommend is Clive Hamilton's book, Affluenza. That's a slightly different book. It's not strictly on property investment and finance. However, it gives an important insight into the way that the community thinks and behaves, which I think the property economist should be aware of.